The night air hung thick and cold over Alexandria, Virginia, as the clock struck just past 11 on the 16th of March, 1957. Two patrol officers, veterans who'd seen their share of drunks, drifters, and the disturbed, pulled their cruiser alongside a man standing motionless beneath a flickering street lamp. What happened in the next 20 minutes would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The man was dressed immaculately. Too immaculately. His suit appeared brand new, yet outdated in a way neither officer could quite articulate. But it wasn't his clothing that made Officer Daniels hand drift toward his service weapon. It was the eyes. Clear, unblinking, and studying them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing insects. When the stranger spoke, his words were calm, measured, and utterly impossible. He needed to speak with President Eisenhower. He had traveled from Venus. Time was running out. Standard procedure said to take him in for evaluation. But nothing about this was standard. At the station, things got stranger. The man offered his hand for fingerprinting without resistance, almost with amusement. The ink rolled across skin that felt wrong, too smooth, too cool. When they pressed his fingers to the card, nothing transferred. They tried again, and again. 6 attempts. The ink simply wouldn't adhere properly, leaving only smudged, meaningless marks where clear prints should have been. The desk sergeant, a man who'd processed thousands of arrests, stood staring at those blank cards like they were written in a language beyond human comprehension. The medical examination that followed violated everything 3 military doctors thought they understood about human physiology. The stranger's pulse was there, but irregular in ways that should have indicated severe cardiac distress. Yet, he sat calmly, that same slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His body temperature registered just cool enough to raise alarm. His blood pressure readings made no sense, fluctuating wildly between measurements taken mere minutes apart. One doctor would later tell his wife, in a moment of wine-loosened confession, that looking into the man's eyes during the examination made him feel like he was falling into empty space. By dawn, the stranger who called himself Valiant Thor was no longer in Alexandria. Someone had made phone calls. Someone with enough authority to bypass every protocol, to erase intake records, to make an impossible problem disappear into the machinery of classified government operations. Within 48 hours, according to sources that emerged decades later, he was inside the Pentagon itself. Not in a holding cell, not in an interrogation room, but granted access, clearance, and something that looked disturbingly like diplomatic courtesy. For 3 years, he allegedly walked those corridors. 3 years. While America and the Soviet Union pointed nuclear arsenals at each other, while schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, while the world teetered on the edge of annihilation, something not human moved through the highest levels of American military intelligence. The official record, of course, says none of this happened. There are no files, no photographs, no documentation of any kind. Just whispers from men who saw him, who spoke with him, who came away changed in ways they could never quite explain. The few who've broken their silence describe the same unsettling details. How he never seemed to eat, though he attended official functions. How his knowledge of classified programs he shouldn't have known existed made hardened intelligence officers go pale. How his warnings about humanity's future carried the weight of someone who had already seen how the story ends. He spoke of ecological collapse, of spiritual bankruptcy, of a civilization racing toward self-destruction with its eyes wide shut. What deal was made in those closed-door meetings? What knowledge was exchanged? Some researchers claim he offered technology, solutions to energy crises and environmental degradation. Others suggest he asked for something far more disturbing in return: access to study us to understand what drives the species to build weapons capable of rendering their own world uninhabitable. Perhaps most chilling is the possibility that our government, faced with proof that we are not alone, chose to keep that revelation locked away, that they decided humanity couldn't handle the truth. Then, as mysteriously as he arrived, Valiant Thor vanished. March of 1960. Diane. Some say he walked out of the Pentagon and was never seen again. Others claim a spacecraft was spotted by military radar, moving at impossible speeds away from Earth. The officers who first encountered him on that cold Virginia night were visited by men in dark suits who suggested, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that they misremembered the events, that the stranger was just another disturbed individual, long since forgotten. But the questions remain, hanging in the air like radiation that won't decay. If it was all a hoax, an elaborate delusion, why the secrecy? Why the classified documentation that supposedly doesn't exist? Why do Freedom of Information Act requests about this case still get denied on national security grounds more than 60 years later? And if it wasn't a hoax, if something truly otherworldly did spend 3 years inside our most secure military installation, what does that say about the reality we think we understand? The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world moved on. But somewhere in a locked file, in a basement archive beneath the Pentagon, or buried in a facility that doesn't appear on any map, perhaps there's evidence that in March of 1957, the universe reached out, that we weren't ready for contact, that we chose fear and secrecy over wonder and transformation. And perhaps most terrifying of all, what if Valiant Thor's warnings were real? What if everything he predicted about humanity's trajectory toward catastrophe is unfolding exactly as he said it would? We're left with a mystery that cuts deeper than whether one strange man was human or not. We're left wondering if our leaders, faced with cosmic truth, chose to keep us in the dark, and whether that choice has doomed us to face alone the very dangers we were warned about. The call came in to the Alexandria Police Department just after dawn on March 16, 1957. A strange craft had been spotted landing in an open field near the outskirts of town, and witnesses reported seeing a figure emerge from the metallic structure. Officer Michael Henderson was first on the scene, and according to Dr. Frank Stranges, who would later chronicle these events in remarkable detail, what Henderson encountered that morning would change the trajectory of his entire life. The spacecraft itself defied conventional description. Witnesses who observed it from a distance described a smooth, disc-shaped object with no visible seams or rivets, gleaming in the early morning light like polished chrome. There were no wings, no exhaust ports, no conventional means of propulsion that anyone could identify. It simply sat there in the grass, silent and impossible, waiting for what would happen next. Henderson approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to a service weapon, though he wasn't quite sure what threat this situation might present. The training academy had never covered first contact protocols. That's when the door appeared. Not opened, witnesses would later insist, but materialized as if the solid metal hull had simply decided to become permeable. From this opening stepped a man who looked almost human, almost normal, but carried with him an aura of profound otherness that made every person who saw him instinctively take a step backward. He was tall, standing at approximately 6 feet 2 inches, with shoulder-length hair that seemed to catch light in an unusual way. His eyes were described as penetrating, almost luminescent, and his skin had a quality that several witnesses struggled to articulate. It wasn't pale or tan or any conventional shade, but seemed somehow to shift subtly depending on the angle of observation. The being raised his hands in what appeared to be a gesture of peace. And this is where the accounts begin to fracture into the truly bizarre. Officer Henderson would later confide to investigators that the man's hands seemed wrong somehow. Too symmetrical, too perfect, with fingers that moved in ways that seemed to defy normal joint articulation. In some versions of this story, versions that Dr. Stranges himself seemed to corroborate through secondary sources, those hands bore 6 fingers each instead of the standard 5. This detail remains one of the most contested elements of the entire account, with some witnesses adamantly confirming it, while others saw only normal human hands. What everyone agreed on, however, was what happened when they attempted to process this stranger through standard police procedures. The being identified himself as Valiant Thor, claiming to come from the planet Venus. He spoke perfect English with no discernible accent, though some who heard him detected an unusual cadence to his speech, as if he were translating thoughts into words through some intermediate step that human beings don't require. He was cooperative, almost preternaturally calm, as if being taken into custody by armed officers of an alien world was exactly what he had anticipated and prepared for. Officer Henderson radioed for backup, and within 20 minutes, 4 additional patrol units had arrived on the scene. The spacecraft was cordoned off, though it would vanish before proper military examination could occur. dematerializing as mysteriously as its passenger had arrived. At the police station, standard booking procedures commenced. Photographs were taken, basic information was recorded, and then came the fingerprinting. This is where the official record begins to disintegrate into something that defies conventional explanation. According to Dr. Stranges, who interviewed multiple officers present during these events, Valiant Thor had no fingerprints. Not obscured fingerprints, not worn-down prints from some accident or chemical exposure, but skin that was completely smooth and uniform, where the unique whorls and ridges of human fingerprints should have been. The booking officer attempted the process 3 times, each time producing only smudged, useless impressions on the card. It was as if Thor's fingers simply refused to interact with the ink in any way that would leave a readable pattern. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Officers who had been treating this as an unusual but manageable situation began to realize they were dealing with something that existed entirely outside their framework of understanding. One officer suggested it might be a hoax, some kind of elaborate makeup or prosthetic that obscured the prints, but physical examination revealed no such artifice. The skin was smooth, warm to the touch, and appeared completely natural despite its impossible characteristic. Medical personnel were called in to perform a basic examination, and here the anomalies multiplied further. Thor's pulse was detectable, but irregular by human standards, beating at a rate that seemed to vary without corresponding to any physical activity or emotional state. His body temperature registered slightly cooler than the human norm, hovering around 94 degrees Fahrenheit when it should have been closer to 98.6. His eyes, when examined with standard optical equipment, showed peculiarities in the retinal structure that the examining physician couldn't immediately explain. Nothing was wildly alien. Nothing was so bizarre as to be obviously non-human. But every measurement sat just slightly outside the expected range, creating a cumulative portrait of someone who looked human but wasn't. Not quite, not entirely. When offered food and water, Thor politely declined. Over the hours he remained in police custody, this refusal would become another piece of the puzzle that simply didn't fit. He showed no signs of hunger or thirst despite going nearly 6 hours without sustenance. When pressed, he explained that human food was incompatible with his biology, that attempting to consume it would cause him significant distress. One officer, perhaps trying to lighten the increasingly tense atmosphere, joked about pizza being universally appealing. Thor simply smiled, a gesture that witnesses described as kind but fundamentally sad, as if he pitied their inability to comprehend what he was trying to tell them. Then the phone calls began. First came an inquiry from the county sheriff's office, asking for details about the unusual detainee. Standard protocol, nothing alarming. But within an hour, calls started coming from higher up the chain. State police wanted information. Then someone identifying themselves as being from the Department of Defense requested a full briefing. The Alexandria police chief, a man named Robert Carlson, who had served in World War II and thought he'd seen everything the world had to offer, found himself on the phone with a Pentagon official less than 3 hours after Thor's initial apprehension. The message was clear and non-negotiable. The stranger was to be held exactly where he was, and a military escort was en route to assume custody immediately. This is where the story pivots from strange to genuinely unsettling. Why would the Pentagon, the heart of American military power, dispatch personnel to retrieve what was officially being treated as a potentially disturbed individual, claiming to be from another planet? Small-town police departments encounter delusional people regularly, individuals who believe themselves to be Napoleon or Jesus or visitors from Mars. These cases are handled locally, with mental health professionals providing assessment and care. They do not result in immediate federal intervention and military transportation to the nation's capital. The military escort arrived just before sunset on that same day. According to witnesses, 3 unmarked vehicles pulled up to the Alexandria police station and 6 men in dark suits emerged. They presented credentials that granted them immediate authority to take Thor into federal custody. The local officers were told that this was now a matter of national security, and any discussion of the day's events with unauthorized personnel would be treated as a breach of classified information. Thor went with them willingly, even gratefully, as if this was exactly the outcome he had been expecting all along. The convoy departed for Washington, D.C., and Valiant Thor allegedly disappeared into the Pentagon, where Dr. Strange has claimed he would remain for the next 3 years. But here's what gnaws at the edges of this story, what transforms it from a simple tale of delusion or hoax into something that demands deeper consideration. Why was there no public announcement? If someone claiming to be from Venus had been taken into federal custody, if there was even the slightest possibility that this claim might be legitimate, wouldn't that be information of extraordinary public importance? The government has protocols for everything from nuclear accidents to disease outbreaks. Surely, contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence would warrant some form of public disclosure, even if only to deny the more sensational elements. Instead, there was silence. Complete, total, institutional silence. No press release from the Pentagon, no statement from the Alexandria Police Department, no official record that any of this had ever happened. The witnesses who saw the spacecraft and the strange visitor were quietly discouraged from speaking publicly about their experience. Officer Henderson transferred to a different precinct within the year and refused to discuss that morning for the rest of his career. The medical personnel who examined Thor found that their notes had disappeared from departmental files. It was as if the entire event had been carefully erased, scrubbed from official memory, while remaining vivid and troubling in the minds of those who had been there. Frank Stranges would spend decades researching this case, interviewing witnesses, collecting testimony, and building a portrait of those few hours that raises more questions than it answers. The physical impossibilities mount upon examination. A man with no fingerprints, with hands that some swear bore 6 fingers, who could survive without food or water, whose body registered as almost but not quite human on every medical test performed. A spacecraft that multiple trained observers witnessed, that appeared on no radar, that left no physical trace once it vanished. And a response from the highest levels of military authority that suggests someone, somewhere, believed this was real enough to require immediate containment and absolute secrecy. What happened in Alexandria that morning remains one of the most compelling and troubling accounts in the entire Valiant Thor narrative. Not because we can prove it happened, but because we cannot definitively prove it didn't. The fluorescent lights of the Pentagon's third-floor corridor hummed their monotonous song on a Tuesday morning in February of 1957 when something unprecedented occurred. A being who claimed to have traveled from Venus walked past offices where men in crisp military uniforms calculated nuclear strike capabilities and debated the merits of missile systems that could end civilization. According to the testimony of multiple individuals who would later come forward, this was not a single occurrence, but rather the beginning of what some insiders referred to as the strangest 3 years in American defense history. His name, as given to the limited circle who knew of his presence, was Valiant Thor. The accounts describe a figure indistinguishable from a human being in appearance, standing roughly 6 feet tall, with brown hair and penetrating eyes that witnesses claimed seemed to hold depths of knowledge that made even the most decorated generals uncomfortable. What made this situation descend from the merely unusual into the realm of profound disquiet was not just his alleged extraterrestrial origin, but the sheer mundane horror of his supposed integration into the highest levels of American government during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Think about the profound strangeness of this claim for a moment. We are asked to believe that while American schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills beneath their desks, while families built fallout shelters in their backyards and stockpiled canned goods against the possibility of nuclear annihilation, an extraterrestrial visitor was sitting in classified Pentagon briefings. He was allegedly reviewing documents marked with the highest security clearances. He was supposedly offering solutions to problems that consumed the greatest scientific minds of the generation. The individuals who have spoken about Thor's presence describe a being who maintained an office, kept regular hours, and navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of the Department of Defense with the patience of someone who understood that human institutions moved slowly, agonizingly slowly, when measured against the lifespan of someone who claimed. He wore suits purchased from Washington department stores. He ate meals in the Pentagon cafeteria. He attended meetings where men argued about budgets and jurisdictions and the proper channels through which information must flow. According to researcher and contactee Frank Stranges, who would later write extensively about Thor and claim to have met him personally, the extraterrestrial visitor had arrived with a specific mission. He had not come to conquer or to warn of impending doom, though his message contained elements of both. He had come, these accounts tell us, to offer help. Practical, specific, implementable help with the crises that plagued humanity in the late 1950s. The meetings with President Dwight Eisenhower allegedly occurred on multiple occasions. Picture this scene, as described by those who claim knowledge of it. The Oval Office, that seat of earthly power where decisions affecting millions were made daily, hosting a conversation between the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and a being from another world. Eisenhower, a man who had seen the beaches of Normandy and the liberation of concentration camps, who understood the capacity for both human heroism and human evil, supposedly sat across from Thor and listened to proposals that could have fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. Vice President Richard Nixon, ever the political calculator, allegedly attended some of these sessions. Imagine Nixon, ambitious and paranoid even then, taking notes while an extraterrestrial being outlined technological advances that could render oil obsolete. Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy, tasked with maintaining American military superiority in the face of Soviet advances, supposedly participated in discussions about energy systems that could eliminate scarcity, and with it, one of the primary drivers of international conflict. What did Thor propose during these alleged meetings? The specifics, according to those who claim insider knowledge, were revolutionary yet achievable. He outlined energy generation systems that could provide unlimited, clean power without the need for fossil fuels or the dangers of nuclear fission. These were not vague promises of future technologies, but detailed schematics and explanations of physical principles that, he claimed, had been perfected on other worlds. Energy systems that could desalinate ocean water on massive scales, turning deserts into gardens and eliminating water scarcity. Methods of power generation that produced no waste, no pollution, no radioactive byproducts that would poison the earth for millennia. In the realm of medicine, the proposals allegedly became even more specific and more tantalizing. According to the accounts, Thor described techniques for treating cancer that did not rely on radiation or toxic chemicals, but instead worked with the body's natural systems to eliminate malignant cells. He outlined approaches to heart disease that could have saved countless lives from the condition that was rapidly becoming the leading killer in industrialized nations. Regenerative medicine techniques that could heal injuries considered permanent. Methods of disease prevention that addressed root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Wow. The environmental technologies he supposedly presented were equally transformative. Systems for neutralizing pollution, methods for remediating soil that had been damaged by industrial agriculture, techniques for atmospheric cleansing that could reverse the accumulation of industrial toxins, agricultural advances that could increase crop yields while actually improving soil health, eliminating the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides that were already beginning their long work of poisoning ecosystems. Every account from those claiming knowledge of these meetings emphasizes the same disturbing detail. Thor did not ask for anything in return. There was no demand for tribute or worship or political power. He presented these solutions freely, as gifts from one civilization to another. The only condition, according to the testimony, was that these technologies be used for the benefit of all humanity, not weaponized or monopolized by any single nation or corporation. And here, in the gap between what was offered and what was accepted, lies the heart of the horror that permeates this story. Because according to every account, every solution Thor proposed was rejected. The reasons for these rejections, as explained by those who claim to have witnessed the debates and discussions, reveal a portrait of human civilization at a crossroads, choosing knowingly to take the darker path. The energy technologies were rejected, we are told, because they would destabilize the global economy. Oil companies represented trillions of dollars in infrastructure and investment. Entire nations depended on petroleum exports for their economic survival. The utility companies had monopolies to protect, shareholders to satisfy, political influence to maintain. Free energy would collapse these systems, and the economic chaos that would result was deemed unacceptable. Military and intelligence officials allegedly raised security concerns. If such technologies were released, they argued, how long before adversaries obtained them? How long before terrorist organizations or rogue nations possessed capabilities that could upset the delicate balance of power that prevented global war? Better to maintain the current system, dangerous as it was, than to risk an unknown future where energy abundance eliminated the dependencies that made nations predictable. The medical advances faced similar objections. The pharmaceutical industry had become a major economic force, employing hundreds of thousands and generating massive profits. Cancer treatment, expensive and ongoing, sustained entire sectors of the healthcare economy. Cures that actually worked would eliminate entire categories of revenue. Doctors had been trained in specific methodologies. Hospitals had invested in expensive equipment. Insurance companies had built business models around chronic disease management. The disruption would be complete and catastrophic for established interests. Some of the military advisors supposedly argued that extending human lifespan or eliminating major diseases would lead to overpopulation crises. The world's resources were already strained, they contended. What would happen if mortality rates dropped dramatically? Where would people live? How would they be fed? The math, cold and brutal, suggested that human suffering and death served a purpose in maintaining global stability. The environmental technologies encountered perhaps the most cynical resistance. Agricultural corporations had invested heavily in chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Their business models depended on selling products that depleted soil and created dependency. Sustainable methods that improved rather than degraded the land threatened these profit streams. Heavy industry had no incentive to adopt cleaner processes when pollution was free and the costs were borne by the public rather than corporate balance sheets. Frank Strange's and others who have written about Thor's time in the Pentagon describe the extraterrestrial visitors' growing understanding of the forces that governed human decision-making. Thor had apparently arrived with expectations shaped by societies that had moved beyond scarcity economics and power-based politics. He encountered instead a civilization that had developed technologies capable of ending human life on Earth, but seemed incapable of implementing technologies that could save it. The accounts describe Thor attending briefing after briefing where men discussed strategy and tactics, budgets and appropriations, political considerations, and public perception. He witnessed, these stories tell us, the machinery of government grinding away, each component protecting its territory, each individual calculating how decisions would affect their career advancement, each agency fighting to preserve its relevance and funding. In some of the more detailed testimonies, we hear about specific moments that crystallize the situation's absurdity. Thor allegedly once sat through a 4-hour meeting about the proper procedure for requisitioning office supplies. While famines raged in multiple countries and diseases he could have helped cure killed thousands daily. He listened to debates about which committees had jurisdiction over which aspects of defense policy, while holding knowledge of defensive technologies that would make nuclear weapons obsolete. The psychological weight of this scenario, if even partially true, staggers the imagination. A being with solutions to humanity's greatest problems, trapped in a bureaucratic maze designed not to solve problems but to manage them, not to implement change but to prevent it. An extraterrestrial visitor, learning that human institutions often functioned not despite their inefficiency, but because of it, that complexity and delay served purposes that had nothing to do with the stated missions of the organizations. According to the timeline provided by those who researched this story, Thor's residency at the Pentagon lasted approximately 3 years, from 1957 to 1960. During this time, the accounts tell us, he continued to attend meetings, to offer advice, to propose solutions. He adapted to the frustrations and limitations of working within human governmental structures. He learned the unwritten rules about what could be said in which forums, which topics were genuinely open for discussion, and which were merely theater. Some researchers have pointed to Eisenhower's farewell address in January of 1961 as potentially relevant to Thor's presence. In that famous speech, Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, about the acquisition of unwarranted influence by a conjunction of immense military establishment and large arms industry. He cautioned that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power existed and would persist. Was this warning informed by watching an extraterrestrial visitor's technologies rejected because they threatened entrenched interests? We cannot know for certain, but the timing invites speculation. The story concludes with Thor leaving the Pentagon sometime in 1960, returning, the accounts claim, to his ship and eventually to his home world. He had accomplished his mission in the sense that he had offered assistance. He had failed in that the assistance had been refused. The technologies that could have transformed human civilization allegedly remained in classified files, studied perhaps but never implemented, too dangerous to existing power structures to ever see the light of day. What are we to make of such claims? The story of Valiant Thor exists in that shadowy space between documented history and elaborate mythology. No official records confirm his presence. No photographs exist that can be verified. The entire account rests on testimony from individuals who claim insider knowledge, supported by no physical evidence that skeptics would find compelling. Yet the story persists and spreads because it resonates with something many people sense about how human institutions function. Whether Thor was real or metaphorical, the scenario he allegedly encountered reflects genuine patterns in how transformative technologies are actually received by established systems. History provides numerous examples of innovations that threatened existing interests being suppressed, delayed, or controlled regardless of their potential benefit. The tale forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and institutional behavior. If solutions to our greatest problems were offered freely, would we accept them? Or would we reject them to preserve systems that benefit the few at the expense of the many? Can civilizations organized around scarcity and competition adopt technologies of abundance without fundamentally restructuring themselves? And are we capable of such restructuring, or are we locked into patterns that will persist until they destroy us? The mundane horror of Valiant Thor's alleged Pentagon residency lies not in alien invasion or cosmic threat, but in the possibility that our greatest enemy is our own inability to choose wisely when given the chance. That we might meet beings from other worlds and learn nothing, accept nothing, change nothing because change threatens those who currently hold power. That somewhere in classified files might rest solutions to problems that kill millions. Solutions we refuse to implement, not because they would not work, but precisely because they would. The visitor who materialized in the New Jersey countryside during the spring of 1957 claimed he came bearing a message that would shake the foundations of human civilization. But before Valiant Thor could deliver his cosmic warning, he had to reveal something far more unsettling. Earth was not alone in its struggles, and humanity's violent adolescence was being monitored with growing alarm by forces beyond our comprehension. According to the accounts documented by Frank Stranges and others who claimed direct contact with Thor, the enigmatic visitor represented what he called the Council of 12, an interplanetary governing body that supposedly oversees the delicate balance of civilizations across our solar system. Thor allegedly described this council as ancient beyond human reckoning, comprised of representatives from inhabited worlds that had long ago transcended the primitive conflicts that still plague Earth. Venus, Mars, Saturn's moons, and other locations we consider barren wastelands were, according to Thor, home to civilizations operating at frequencies and dimensions invisible to our limited perception. The implications of this revelation cast a shadow far darker than simple alien contact. If Thor's claims held any truth, humanity was not the master of its own destiny, but rather a quarantined patient, isolated from a cosmic community due to our aggressive tendencies and spiritual immaturity. We were being watched, evaluated, and found dangerously wanting. Thor's primary mission, he allegedly stated during those Pentagon briefings, centered on a single terrifying reality. Humanity's newfound nuclear capabilities had elevated us from cosmic irrelevance to cosmic threat. The splitting of the atom, that triumph of human ingenuity celebrated in the late 1940s, had sent shockwaves through dimensions we couldn't perceive. Nuclear detonations, Thor supposedly explained, didn't simply release energy in our three-dimensional reality. They tore holes in the fabric of space itself, creating disturbances that rippled across multiple planes of existence. Witnesses claim Thor spoke with unusual emotion when describing the nuclear tests conducted in the Nevada desert and the Pacific atolls. He could allegedly perceive the energetic signatures of these explosions in ways that human instruments could never detect. Each mushroom cloud, he said, represented a wound in the Earth's electromagnetic field, a scar that would take generations to heal. But the physical damage was merely the beginning of his warnings. The metaphysical implications, Thor described painted an even grimmer picture. Nuclear weapons, according to his testimony, didn't just destroy matter, they disrupted the spiritual evolution of every living thing within their influence. Human souls, Thor allegedly explained, exist within an energetic matrix that connects all consciousness on Earth. When atomic fire vaporizes human bodies, it doesn't simply end those lives. It tears those souls violently from their natural evolutionary path, creating trauma that echoes across dimensional boundaries. Those who claim to have been present during Thor's warnings report that he could see what he called the human aura, the electromagnetic field surrounding each person that supposedly reveals their spiritual state, health, and even their thoughts. Dr. Frank Stranges described watching Thor interact with Pentagon officials, claiming the visitor would sometimes pause mid-conversation, his eyes seeming to look through rather than at the person speaking. Thor allegedly told Stranges that reading human thoughts was not a skill he employed deliberately, but rather an unavoidable consequence of his expanded perception. Imagine being unable to not hear every radio station broadcasting simultaneously, Thor supposedly said. That's what human minds feel like to someone operating at higher frequencies. This metaphysical awareness allowed Thor to make predictions that, according to believers, have come true with disturbing accuracy. He allegedly warned of escalating wars throughout the Middle East, conflicts that would drag on for decades with no clear resolution. He spoke of environmental catastrophes that would multiply as humanity continued treating Earth as an infinite resource rather than a finite organism. Rising seas, violent storms, mass extinctions, ecological collapse. All of these horrors were supposedly laid out in Thor's prophecies during those 3 years he allegedly spent on Earth. But perhaps most chilling were Thor's warnings about spiritual degradation. He predicted, witnesses claim, that humanity would become increasingly disconnected from nature, from each other, and from their own inner awareness. Technology would advance, he said, but wisdom would recede. People would communicate more, but connect less. Information would multiply exponentially, while understanding diminished. We would build towers of glass and steel while our souls withered in the shadows they cast. Looking back from our current vantage point, the accuracy of these alleged predictions creates a mounting sense of dread. The Middle East has indeed been locked in seemingly endless conflict since the 1950s. Environmental destruction has accelerated beyond the worst predictions of Thor's era. We carry devices that connect us to billions of people yet report epidemic levels of loneliness and disconnection. Climate change, mass extinction events, rising authoritarianism, nuclear proliferation beyond what even the Cold War witnessed. The list of fulfilled prophecies reads like a cosmic indictment. Thor allegedly possessed the ability to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, a claim that sounds like science fiction until we consider quantum physics and string theory, which propose exactly such multidimensional realities. Those who interacted with Thor reported unsettling moments when he would react to things no one else could perceive, conversing with empty air or reaching out to touch something invisible. When questioned, Thor supposedly explained that our three-dimensional perception represents only a tiny sliver of actual reality. Most of what exists, he claimed, vibrates at frequencies our physical senses cannot detect. This interdimensional awareness gave Thor what witnesses described as an almost godlike presence. He allegedly knew things about people's lives he could not possibly have learned through conventional means. Personal tragedies, secret fears, hidden illnesses. Thor would sometimes reference these details casually, apparently unaware that such knowledge was supposed to be private. Nancy Warren, a nurse who claimed to have met Thor during his time at the Pentagon, reported that he once told her about a childhood incident she had never shared with anyone, describing it in perfect detail, including the dress she had been wearing and the specific words her mother had spoken. The Council of 12, according to Thor's testimony, had been debating Earth's fate for decades. Some members allegedly advocated for direct intervention, a dramatic revelation that would force humanity to acknowledge our place in a larger cosmic community. Others argued for continued observation and subtle guidance, working through select human contacts to slowly elevate consciousness without triggering the chaos that full disclosure might unleash. A third faction, Thor reportedly admitted with visible sadness, believed Earth should be completely quarantined, cut off from cosmic community until we either evolved beyond our violent tendencies or destroyed ourselves. Thor's mission, he allegedly stated, was a last attempt by the intervention faction to change humanity's trajectory through official channels. By approaching the highest levels of government, by offering proof of extraterrestrial civilization, along with technological and spiritual wisdom, the Council hoped to inspire a fundamental shift in human priority. The fact that this mission ultimately failed, that Thor's warnings were allegedly ignored and his presence covered up, represented a dark turning point. If we believe the accounts, humanity chose the path of continued isolation, preferring comfortable lies to uncomfortable cosmic truths. The prophecies Thor allegedly shared included specific time frames that add another layer of unease. He supposedly warned that if humanity did not change course by the end of the 20th century, certain tipping points would be passed from which recovery would become exponentially more difficult. Environmental systems would begin cascading failures. Social structures would fracture under the weight of inequality and technological disruption. The very fabric of human civilization would begin unraveling in ways both visible and invisible. We now live in the timeline Thor allegedly predicted, the one where humanity ignored the warnings. Every year brings new temperature records, unprecedented storms, collapsing ice sheets, and extinct species. We've added thousands of nuclear weapons to global arsenals rather than eliminating them. We've developed artificial intelligence without developing the wisdom to control it. We've connected the entire planet through digital networks, while tribalism and hatred reach fever pitch. It's as though we took Thor's prophecies as a blueprint rather than a warning. The darkest implication of Thor's alleged mission is this: we were given a chance, and we failed. Representatives of advanced civilizations extended a hand, and we turned away. The cosmic community evaluated us and found us unready, perhaps even dangerous. If Thor's account holds any truth, Earth remains under quarantine, not because we're unnoticed, but because we're considered too primitive, too violent, too spiritually immature to join the larger galactic family. And perhaps most unsettling of all, if interdimensional beings like Thor can perceive our thoughts, read our auras, and see the spiritual sickness spreading through human civilization, what must they think of us now? What do they see when they look at humanity in the 21st century? Do they see hope for eventual evolution, or do they see a species accelerating towards self-destruction, proving the quarantine faction right all along? The silence from the stars might not indicate we're alone. It might indicate we've been written off, left to face the consequences of choices we made when we had the chance to choose differently. On the morning of March 16, 1957, a man walked into the Pentagon claiming to be from Venus. At least, that's what Dr. Frank Stranges wanted the world to believe. And for more than 4 decades, until his death in 2008, this Christian evangelist staked his entire reputation on a story that would make even the most credulous UFO enthusiast pause. But here's what makes the Valiant Thor case different from countless other contactee tales. Stranges wasn't alone. A small constellation of witnesses emerged over the years, each adding their own piece to a puzzle that either reveals an extraordinary truth or represents one of the most elaborate collaborative delusions in modern American folklore. Dr. Frank Stranges was not a fringe character when he first encountered the Valiant Thor story. By the mid-1960s, he had established himself as a reasonably successful evangelical minister, traveling the country delivering sermons at churches and conventions. He held multiple theology degrees, though researchers would later question the accreditation of some of these institutions. He presented himself as a man of science and faith, someone who could bridge the gap between the secular and the spiritual. His radio program reached thousands of listeners. He was, by most accounts, a charismatic speaker who commanded attention when he entered a room. This background is important because it raises a troubling question. Why would a man with so much to lose attach himself so completely to a story about a Venusian spaceman living in the Pentagon? According to Strange's own account, his introduction to Valiant Thor came not through a close encounter of his own, but through a chance meeting at a convention in 1958. A stranger approached him with an incredible tale, claiming that an extraterrestrial being was currently residing beneath the Pentagon, meeting with high-level government officials. The stranger said he had met this being personally. Stranges, intrigued but skeptical, filed the story away in his mind. But then, or so he claimed, he received a phone call. The details of this call varied slightly in different retellings, but the core remained the same. Someone with access, someone with credentials, was inviting him to come to the Pentagon to meet this visitor from another world. What happened next forms the centerpiece of Strange's book, Stranger at the Pentagon, first published in 1967. He describes being escorted through security, down into the lower levels of the building, into a room where he met a man who looked perfectly human, except for one detail: he had no fingerprints. This man introduced himself as Valiant Thor, or Val, as he preferred. He stood 6 feet tall with brown wavy hair and eyes that Strange's described as both penetrating and compassionate. Thor spoke English fluently, with no accent. His mission, he explained, was to help humanity avoid nuclear destruction and to guide us towards spiritual enlightenment. He had been on Earth since March of 1957 and would remain until March of 1960 before returning to his home world. Strange's claimed he met with Thor multiple times over those 3 years. They discussed theology, philosophy, the nature of the universe, and humanity's place within it. Thor allegedly carried credentials signed by President Dwight Eisenhower himself, granting him access to the highest levels of government. He lived in a specially prepared apartment beneath the Pentagon, where select military and scientific personnel could consult with him. His ship remained parked at a secret location, occasionally visited by officials who wanted to understand its technology. Strange's maintained that photographs were taken, documents were signed, and dozens of people had direct contact with this extraterrestrial visitor. The book itself is a strange artifact. It reads part biblical prophecy, part science fiction, part conspiracy thriller. Strange's weaves together spiritual teachings, alleged government cover-ups, and detailed descriptions of Thor's appearance and message. The writing oscillates between the measured tone of a man presenting evidence and the breathless excitement of a true believer. Critics have pointed out numerous inconsistencies within the text itself. Dates don't always align. Details change between chapters. Some of the Pentagon procedures Strange's describes don't match the actual security protocols of that era. Yet, thousands bought the book. Many believed. Some still do. But Strange's wasn't the only witness to come forward. Perhaps the most significant supporting testimony came from a man named Harley Andrew Byrd, who claimed to be the nephew of the famous Admiral Richard Byrd, the polar explorer whose own career had become entangled with UFO lore and hollow Earth theories. Harley Byrd stated that his uncle had not only met Valiant Thor, but had been one of the first military officials to encounter him when his ship landed at Edwards Air Force Base in 1957. According to Harley, Admiral Byrd served as a liaison between Thor and President Eisenhower during those crucial first days of contact. The problem with Harley Byrd's testimony is that it's nearly impossible to verify his family connection to the Admiral. Genealogical researchers have found no evidence that Admiral Richard Byrd had a nephew named Harley Andrew. The family trees don't align. No military records confirm Harley's own claimed service. Yet his accounts, delivered in interviews and at UFO conferences throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, contain specific details that seem too elaborate to be simple fabrication. He described his uncle's private journals, conversations at family gatherings, the weight of the secret his uncle carried. If Harley was lying, he was committed to an extraordinarily detailed lie. If he was telling the truth, then the entire story gained a connection to one of the 20th century's most respected military figures. Beyond Strange's and Harley Byrd, other witnesses emerged, though often in frustratingly vague ways. Former Pentagon employees, speaking anonymously, claimed to remember strange security protocols in the late 1950s. A man who worked as a driver said he once transported someone to a secure underground facility who didn't quite look right, though he couldn't explain what he meant. A secretary recalled filing reports with unusual classification marks she'd never seen before or since. These testimonies appeared in UFO magazines, on late-night radio programs, in the margins of conspiracy literature. None provided smoking gun evidence. All contributed to the growing mythology. Some witnesses seemed more credible than others. A former Air Force officer named Paul Slade gave interviews in the 1980s, claiming he had seen Valiant Thor at a distance during a visit to Pentagon offices. Unlike Strange's detailed encounters, Slade's account was brief and uncertain. He saw a man who seemed out of place, who was treated with unusual deference by high-ranking officials. He heard the name Val mentioned. Was it the same person? He couldn't be sure, but something about the encounter stayed with him for decades. Slade's military service was verified. His security clearance for that period was confirmed. But his testimony about Thor remained maddeningly ambiguous. Then there were the more questionable witnesses. A self-proclaimed psychic who claimed telepathic communication with Thor. A woman who said Thor had visited her in a dream with messages about planetary ascension. A man who produced blurry photographs of something he insisted was Thor's ship, though the images could have been anything from a weather balloon to a hubcap thrown in the air. These testimonies muddied the waters, making it easier to dismiss the entire narrative as the domain of cranks and charlatans. Yet even among the noise, certain consistent details emerged across otherwise unconnected accounts. The description of Thor's appearance, the time frame of his alleged visit, the connection to Eisenhower-era national security concerns, the spiritual nature of his message. Dr. Wayne Strange's himself remained remarkably consistent in his story across decades of retellings. Unlike many contactees who embellish or alter their accounts over time, Strange's core narrative stayed the same. The dates matched. The descriptions aligned. He never claimed more than he initially stated, never added dramatic new revelations to keep interest alive. This consistency worked both for and against his credibility. Skeptics argued it suggested a well-rehearsed fiction. Believers pointed to it as evidence of genuine experience. The man himself seemed utterly convinced. In interviews late in his life, when asked if he had any doubts about what he experienced, Strange's would become emotional, even angry. This was not a story to him. This was the defining truth of his existence. The psychological dimensions of the witness testimony are perhaps more intriguing than the question of literal truth. What drives someone like Frank Strange's to build an entire life around a story that most people dismiss as fantasy? Was it delusion, a genuine misinterpretation of more mundane events, or calculated deception? And if deception, to what end? Strange's never became wealthy from the Valiant Thor story. His book sales were modest. His speaking fees remained in the range typical for evangelical ministers. He lost credibility in many circles, faced mockery and dismissal. The cost-benefit analysis of a hoax doesn't add up, unless the benefit wasn't financial, but psychological, a need to be part of something larger, to possess secret knowledge, to serve as a prophet for a new age. The same questions apply to the supporting witnesses. Harley Bird gained no particular fame or fortune from his claims. Paul Slade's vague testimony brought him more skepticism than acclaim. Were they all feeding off each other's stories, creating a shared mythology that felt more real with each retelling? Or had something genuinely unusual occurred in the Pentagon during those years? Something that participants interpreted through the cultural lens of UFO belief and Cold War paranoia. The truth might lie somewhere between fabrication and literal reality, in that strange territory where perception, belief, and experience create their own form of truth. The troubling inconsistencies in witness accounts create their own pattern. Strange has said he met Thor multiple times over 3 years. Harley Bird suggested his uncle had limited contact during the initial encounter. Other witnesses placed Thor at different locations at the same time. The descriptions of his alleged ship varied. Some said it was enormous, others compact. The number of crew members with him changed depending on who was telling the story. These contradictions should sink the entire narrative. In any legal proceeding, such inconsistent testimony would be dismissed. Yet the core elements remain eerily similar across decades and across witnesses who claim no contact with each other. The man with no fingerprints, the 3-year stay, the connection to Eisenhower, the spiritual message about nuclear weapons, the peaceful departure in 1960. As the decades passed and the original witnesses aged, a new generation of researchers attempted to verify the claims through official channels. Freedom of Information Act requests were filed seeking any documentation of a Valiant Thor, any unusual visitor protocols at the Pentagon between 1957 and 1960, any correspondence between Eisenhower and extraterrestrial representatives. The responses were uniformly negative. No records exist. No files have been found. The government's position is clear. This never happened. But believers point out that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in matters of national security. If an extraterrestrial really did spend 3 years in the Pentagon, those files would be classified beyond any level accessible to civilian researchers. The lack of documentation proves nothing one way or another. Dr. Frank Strange has passed away in 2008, taking with him whatever truth lay behind his testimony. He never recanted. He never wavered. In his final interviews, filmed when he was clearly failing in health, he still spoke of Valiant Thor with the conviction of a man relating simple biographical fact. His foundation continues to promote his message, keeping the story alive for new audiences. The witnesses continue to fade. Some have died. Others have fallen silent. But the story persists, passed along through books and websites and YouTube videos, each generation adding their own interpretations, while the original events, whatever they were, recede further into the unverifiable past. In the late 1950s, something extraordinary may have walked the halls of the Pentagon. And if the whispers are true, nearly every trace of its presence was systematically erased from the historical record. The story of Thor, the alleged extraterrestrial visitor who supposedly worked within the highest levels of American military intelligence, has become one of the most compelling and disturbing cases of potential governmental cover-up in modern history. What makes this case particularly chilling is not just the claims themselves, but the suspicious pattern of missing documentation, destroyed records, and silenced witnesses that surrounds this entire episode like a carefully constructed wall of deliberate amnesia. To understand the scope of what may have been hidden, we need to examine the machinery of secrecy that was operating at full capacity during those crucial years from 1957 to 1960. This was the height of the Cold War, when the American government had become extraordinarily skilled at keeping secrets from its own citizens. The infrastructure for classified operations had grown into a vast bureaucracy of compartmentalized information, where the left hand rarely knew what the right hand was doing, and where entire projects could disappear into classification levels so deep that even high-ranking officials remained unaware of their existence. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation into unidentified flying objects, was operational during the entire period of Thor's alleged Pentagon tenure. On the surface, Blue Book presented itself as a scientific and objective inquiry into UFO reports across the nation. But researchers who have spent decades analyzing the project's methods and conclusions have identified a troubling pattern. Blue Book seemed less interested in discovering the truth about UFOs and more focused on explaining them away, regardless of how credible the witnesses or how compelling the evidence might be. The timing is impossible to ignore. During the exact years when Thor was supposedly advising military officials on matters of cosmic importance, Project Blue Book was actively working to dismiss and debunk UFO sightings across the country. Witnesses who reported craft with capabilities far beyond known human technology were told they had seen weather balloons, temperature inversions, or the planet Venus. Trained military pilots who tracked objects on radar were informed they had misread their instruments. The message was clear and consistent. There was nothing to see, nothing to investigate, and anyone who persisted in believing otherwise was foolish or delusional. But what if Project Blue Book was never meant to find the truth? What if its actual purpose was to serve as a public relations smokescreen, a way to appear transparent while concealing operations that were happening at far higher classification level? Some researchers have suggested that Blue Book was the acceptable face of UFO investigation, the program that could be acknowledged and discussed, while the real research was being conducted elsewhere by people with clearances so high that their work would never see the light of day. Consider the complete absence of any official documentation relating to Thor's presence at the Pentagon. In an institution that documents virtually everything, that maintains visitor logs, security clearances, employment records, and mountains of administrative paperwork, there exists not a single piece of official evidence that this being was ever there. The Pentagon, with its legendary bureaucracy, somehow failed to create even one verifiable document about an alleged extraterrestrial working within its walls. This absence is deeply suspicious for several reasons. First, the Pentagon's security protocols during the 1950s were extraordinarily strict. The building was one of the most heavily guarded facilities on Earth. Every visitor was logged, every movement tracked, every security clearance meticulously documented. The idea that an extraterrestrial could have worked there for 3 years without generating any paperwork defies everything we know about how the military operates. Unless, of course, that paperwork existed and was deliberately destroyed. The gaps in Pentagon visitor logs from this specific period are well documented. Researchers attempting to trace the movements of various officials and consultants during the late 1950s have encountered frustrating holes in the records. Entire months are missing from logs that should have been preserved as routine administrative documents. When questioned about these gaps, officials have offered vague explanations about storage problems, routine purging of old records, and simple bureaucratic oversight. But the pattern of missing documentation clusters suspiciously around the exact years of Thor's alleged presence. Document destruction became a systematic practice within certain branches of the military and intelligence communities during this era. We know this because some of the destruction orders themselves have survived. Classified memos from the late 1950s and early 1960s reference the removal and destruction of materials related to sensitive projects. The language is always carefully vague, never specifying exactly what is being destroyed or why, but the intentions are clear. There were things the government did not want future researchers to find, information that needed to disappear completely. The fate of witnesses who claimed knowledge of Thor's presence adds another deeply disturbing layer to this story. At least 7 individuals who allegedly had direct contact with the being or knowledge of the program died under circumstances that range from suspicious to outright impossible to explain. These were not elderly men dying of natural causes. These were people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s in good health, who suddenly succumbed to unusual illnesses, bizarre accidents, or apparent suicides that their families insisted were completely out of character. Frank Olson, a biochemist with deep ties to classified government programs, fell to his death from a hotel window in New York in 1953, several years before Thor's alleged arrival, but during a period when other unusual programs were already underway. For decades, his death was ruled a suicide. His family never believed it. Years later, evidence emerged suggesting that Olson had been murdered because he knew too much about programs the government wanted to keep hidden. While not directly linked to the Thor case, Olson's death established a pattern. The government was willing to silence its own people when secrecy demanded it. Captain Edward Ruppelt, who headed Project Blue Book from 1951 to 1953, died of a heart attack in 1960, at the age of just 37. Ruppelt had become increasingly vocal about his belief that the Air Force was not being honest with the public about what it knew regarding UFOs. He was working on revisions to his book, potentially planning to include information he had previously withheld. Then his heart simply stopped. Young, apparently healthy, and on the verge of revealing more about what he knew. The official cause of death was listed as a coronary thrombosis, an explanation that satisfied the authorities but left many questions unanswered. Then there were the intimidation tactics, less fatal but equally effective at ensuring silence. Witnesses who spoke publicly about unusual events at military facilities during this period often received visits from men in dark suits, who identified themselves only as representatives of the government. These visitors made it clear that continuing to discuss classified matters would have serious consequences. Careers would be destroyed, pensions revoked, families harassed. Some witnesses reported more direct threats, implications that their safety or the safety of their loved ones could not be guaranteed. They persisted in talking. The Eisenhower administration's documented concerns about UFOs provide crucial context for understanding what may have been happening behind the scenes. President Eisenhower, whatever his public statements might have suggested, took the UFO phenomenon seriously. Declassified documents show that briefings about UFO incidents reached the highest levels of government. The president received regular updates about particularly credible sightings, especially those involving military personnel or installations. There are persistent rumors, never officially confirmed but supported by circumstantial evidence, that Eisenhower held secret meetings about the UFO situation. Some researchers claim he met with extraterrestrial beings themselves at military bases in the southwestern United States. While these specific claims remain unverified, what we do know is that Eisenhower was deeply concerned about maintaining control over the UFO narrative, and ensuring that information about the phenomenon did not create public panic or give advantages to the Soviet Union. The president's famous farewell address in 1961, where he warned about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, takes on new significance in this context. Eisenhower spoke of the need to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by forces that could threaten democratic processes. He seemed to be warning the American people about something he had witnessed during his time in office, something that troubled him deeply. Was he thinking about the secrecy apparatus that had grown so powerful it could hide entire realities from public view? The coordination required to successfully erase all evidence of Thor's presence would have been extraordinary, but not impossible. It would have required cooperation across multiple agencies, the participation of dozens, if not hundreds of individuals, all working toward the same goal of total concealment. But history has shown us that the American government is capable of maintaining such coordinated secrecy when it believes national security demands it. The Manhattan Project, which employed over 100,000 people, remained successfully hidden from public knowledge until atomic bombs were actually used. If such a massive undertaking could be kept secret, surely a smaller operation involving a single extraterrestrial visitor could be concealed. The question that haunts this entire investigation is why. If Thor was real, if an extraterrestrial being actually worked within the Pentagon for 3 years, why would the government work so hard to erase every trace of that reality? The most obvious answer is fear. Fear of public panic, fear of religious upheaval, fear of the social chaos that might result from the revelation that humanity is not alone in the universe, and that our governments have been lying about it for decades. But there may be darker reasons as well. Perhaps Thor brought knowledge or technology that gave those in power capabilities they wanted to keep entirely to themselves. Perhaps agreements were made, deals struck that the public could never know about. What we are left with is a void where evidence should be, a carefully constructed absence that feels more significant than random chance or bureaucratic incompetence could explain. The pattern is too consistent, the gaps too convenient, the silencing of witnesses too thorough to dismiss as coincidence. Something happened during those years from 1957 to 1960. Something important enough that powerful people decided it needed to be completely removed from the historical record. The machinery of government secrecy that was operating during this period has only grown more sophisticated in the decades since. Classification systems have become more complex, compartmentalization more extreme, the ability to hide information from public scrutiny more refined. If they could successfully erase Thor from history in the 1950s, what might they be hiding now? What current realities are being systematically concealed, leaving future researchers to puzzle over suspicious gaps and missing documents? The Thor case stands as a monument to the terrifying efficiency of official secrecy, a reminder that history, as we know it, may be a carefully edited version of events, with the most important chapters torn out before we ever got to read them. The winter of 1960 had been brutal in Washington, but nothing compared to the chill that would settle over the corridors of power that March. Thor had been unusually quiet in the preceding weeks, his visits to various government agencies becoming more somber, his usual composed demeanor giving way to something witnesses would later describe as profound disappointment. Those who had worked closely with him during his 3 years on Earth began to notice subtle changes. The being who had once exuded calm authority now carried himself with the weight of someone bearing terrible knowledge, someone who had seen a future he could not prevent. The first indication that something momentous was approaching came on the 7th of March, 1960, when Thor requested a series of final meetings with key officials across multiple departments. Unlike his previous briefings, which had been technical in nature, focusing on propulsion systems and theoretical physics, these final sessions would be different. Those who attended would later speak of them only in hushed tones, and several would refuse to discuss them at all, even decades later. The meetings were scheduled over 3 days, and by all accounts, they followed a pattern that suggested Thor was methodically delivering a message he needed certain people to hear, a warning he hoped might somehow take root even in soil he now believed to be barren. The first meeting took place in a sealed conference room deep within the Pentagon. 11 men attended, their identities still classified to this day, though rumors have persisted that they included high-ranking military officials, intelligence directors, and at least 2 members of the National Security Council. What transpired in that room over the course of 4 hours would haunt those present for the rest of their lives. According to one participant who spoke anonymously to a researcher in 1983, Thor began by thanking them for their time and attention over the past 3 years, his voice carrying a heaviness that immediately put everyone on edge. Then he delivered what he called his final assessment. Humanity, he told them, had been undergoing a test. Not the kind of test they might imagine. Not a simple evaluation of technological capability or military strength, but something far more fundamental. It was a test of spiritual readiness, of moral evolution, of the capacity to transcend the tribal instincts that had served the species during its development, but now threatened its very survival. For 3 years, he explained, he had been observing, teaching, sharing knowledge, waiting to see if humanity would make the crucial leap from adolescence to maturity as a species. He had been watching for signs that Earth's civilizations could move beyond the cycles of violence and exploitation that had defined human history. He had been hoping, he admitted, that he would see evidence of the wisdom necessary to wield the power that humanity was rapidly acquiring through technological advancement. The verdict, he told them with barely concealed sadness, was clear. Humanity had failed. Not in every individual case, he was careful to note. There were people of extraordinary compassion, vision, and courage scattered across the planet. But as a collective, as a civilization, humanity had demonstrated that it was not yet ready to join the broader community of conscious beings in the cosmos. The very institutions he was addressing, he explained, were symptoms of the problem. The secrecy, the weapons development, the inability to cooperate across national boundaries, the treatment of his presence as a strategic advantage to be hoarded, rather than a gift to be shared with all people, all of it pointed to a species still trapped in the thinking patterns of its violent past. What came next was the part that turned blood cold in the veins of those listening. Thor began to describe what he saw coming for Earth, the consequences that would unfold from the choices humanity was making. These were not threats, he emphasized. He was not punishing humanity. Rather, he was describing the natural and inevitable results of the path that had been chosen. It was like watching someone walk toward a cliff and describing the fall that would follow, not as revenge, but as simple physics. He spoke of wars that would escalate beyond anything yet experienced. The conflicts brewing in Southeast Asia would expand into a meat grinder that would consume millions of lives and accomplish nothing except demonstrating humanity's capacity for sustained, pointless destruction. The Middle East would become an eternal wound, bleeding for generations, with each attempt to stanch the flow only spreading the infection further. The nuclear arsenals that nations were building with such pride would come within heartbeats of ending all life on Earth. Not once, but repeatedly, with humanity learning nothing from each near miss, simply continuing the same suicidal game, with slightly modified rules. But the wars, terrible as they would be, were only the beginning. Thor described environmental collapse with a specificity that witnesses found deeply unsettling. He spoke of the planet's atmosphere being altered by industrial emissions, of temperatures rising, of weather patterns becoming chaotic and destructive. He described oceans acidifying and dying, forests disappearing, entire ecosystems collapsing as humanity continued to treat the Earth as an infinite resource to be exploited, rather than a living system to be respected. He predicted that by the time the consequences became undeniable, the momentum would be too great to easily reverse, and humanity would face the choice between radical transformation or gradual extinction. Even more disturbing than the physical predictions was his description of the spiritual darkness he saw descending. He spoke of a civilization that would become increasingly disconnected from meaning, purpose, and authentic human connection. He described technologies of communication that would leave people more isolated than ever, systems of commerce that would reduce all value to monetary exchange, entertainment that would numb rather than enlighten, and a pervasive sense of anxiety and emptiness that would settle over the species like a shroud. People would have more material comfort than ever before, he predicted, and less peace. They would have more information and less wisdom. They would be more connected technologically and more alone spiritually. The anonymous source who described this meeting said that several of the officials present tried to argue, to defend humanity, to suggest that Thor was being too pessimistic. But he had answers for every objection, not with anger, but with the patient sadness of someone who had heard all the rationalizations before and found them wanting. When one official suggested that humanity would surely change course when the dangers became clear, Thor simply shook his head. The problem, he explained, was that humans had evolved to respond to immediate visible threats, not to slow-moving catastrophes that unfolded over decades. By the time the danger was obvious enough to trigger the survival instinct, it would be far too late. Similar meetings took place over the following 2 days with different groups, each session a variation on the same terrible theme. At the State Department, he focused more on the geopolitical dimensions of his prophecy, describing a world that would fragment into competing power blocks, even as problems arose that could only be solved through global cooperation. At a classified facility in Virginia, he spoke to scientists about the specific environmental tipping points he saw approaching, providing data that would only be confirmed by research decades later. Each meeting ended the same way, with Thor expressing his regret that he had to deliver such news and his hope that somehow, despite everything, humanity might surprise him. Word began to spread through the highest levels of government that Thor was preparing to leave. The news created something approaching panic among certain officials who had come to rely on his knowledge and insights. Desperate attempts were made to convince him to stay, to give humanity another chance, to continue his work. But Thor was adamant. His mission, such as it was, had reached its conclusion. There was nothing more he could accomplish here, not at this time. Humanity's path was set, at least for the foreseeable future, and he could not alter it. Only humans could do that, and they had shown no inclination to make the necessary choices. The final departure was scheduled for the morning of March 11, 1960. Exactly how this was coordinated remains unclear, as does the question of who authorized what was about to happen. What is known comes from the accounts of approximately 30 witnesses, including military personnel, government officials, and support staff who happened to be present. Their testimonies, collected over the years by various researchers, paint a consistent picture despite the decades that have passed, and the obvious strangeness of what they claim to have seen. Thor emerged from the Pentagon shortly after 7 in the morning. He was wearing the same simple clothing he had worn for most of his time on Earth, dark pants and a light shirt that seemed oddly normal given the momentous nature of the occasion. He was not escorted by guards or surrounded by officials. Instead, he walked alone, moving with deliberate slowness across the parking area toward an open field that had been quietly cleared of personnel. Those who saw him pass noted his expression, and this is where the accounts become particularly striking. Multiple witnesses, independently and in some cases decades apart, used the same word to describe what they saw on his face: grief. Grief. He looked, they said, like a father leaving children he loved but could not save, like a doctor abandoning patients he knew would not survive, like a teacher walking away from students who refused to learn. Several people who saw him that morning swore they could see tears on his face, though the day was clear and there was no rain. Others said his eyes were red as though he had been crying earlier. The overall impression was of someone experiencing profound emotional pain, a detail that struck many as deeply significant. If Thor was truly an advanced being from another world, the fact that he was capable of such emotion, that he cared enough about humanity to grieve for it, made his departure and his warnings all the more powerful and terrible. He walked for approximately 10 minutes across the open field, his pace steady but unhurried. Behind him, at a respectful distance, followed a small group of officials who had worked most closely with him during his time on Earth. They did not speak. The only sound was the wind and the distant hum of traffic from the surrounding roads. As Thor reached the center of the field, witnesses reported that the air began to shimmer, a distortion similar to heat haze, but more pronounced and clearly artificial in nature. Within this distortion, a shape began to materialize, its form difficult to describe or even perceive clearly. Some described it as spherical, others as elongated, still others as constantly shifting between forms. The consensus was that it hurt to look at directly, that the eyes could not quite focus on it, that it seemed to exist slightly outside of normal space. Before entering what everyone assumed was his spacecraft, Thor turned back to face those who had followed him. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a blessing, and then he spoke his final words to humanity, or at least the final words that were recorded. His voice carried across the field with unnatural clarity, reaching everyone present despite the distance and the wind. What he said has been reported with remarkable consistency across multiple witnesses. He told them that he would return, but not soon. He would return only after humanity had suffered enough to finally be ready to listen, to change, to grow beyond its current limitations. The pain that was coming was not punishment but education, not cruelty but necessity. Sometimes, he said, a species must fall before it can learn to stand properly. Sometimes the only teacher harsh enough to break through stubborn ignorance is experience itself. He hoped, he said, that the suffering would not be so great that nothing remained worth saving, but that outcome was now in humanity's hands, not his. Then he delivered what some witnesses considered a message of hope, and others heard as a final condemnation. Even now, he said, even after everything he had seen, he still believed in humanity's potential. Hidden within the species was greatness, wisdom, compassion, and courage sufficient to transform not only Earth, but to eventually become a light in the darkness for others. But potential unrealized might as well not exist. Knowledge enacted upon was worthless. Capability without will was meaningless. Humanity would have to choose its future, and it would have to live with the consequences of that choice. The witnesses reported that there were indeed tears visible on his face as he spoke these words, streaming down his cheeks in the clear morning light. Then, without further ceremony, he turned and walked into the shimmering distortion. His form seemed to stretch and fade, becoming translucent, and then simply absent, as though he had passed through an invisible door into another space entirely. The distortion intensified for a moment, the air crackling with what some described as static electricity, and then both the shimmer and the impossible craft it concealed were gone. The field was empty, except for the stunned witnesses, standing in silence under a cold March sky. In the days and weeks that followed, there was considerable debate about how to handle what had occurred. The event had too many witnesses to completely suppress, but the implications were too strange and disturbing to publicly acknowledge. A compromise of sorts emerged, the same approach that had governed Thor's entire presence on Earth. Official silence combined with unofficial whispers. No formal announcement was made. The witnesses were reminded of their security clearances and the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. Files were classified, reports were sealed, and slowly the story began to drift from suppressed fact into conspiracy theory, from documented event into urban legend. But Thor's predictions remained, recorded in those sealed files, remembered by those who heard them. And as the years passed, as wars erupted in Vietnam and elsewhere, as nuclear standoffs brought the world to the brink, as environmental scientists began to warn of climate change and ecological collapse, as rates of depression and anxiety climbed despite increasing prosperity, some of those witnesses began to wonder if they had witnessed not a departure, but a prophecy, not an ending, but a terrible beginning. They wondered if Earth was now living through Thor's final warning made manifest, suffering through the consequences he had foreseen, waiting for the day when humanity would finally be ready for his return. The questions hang in the air like smoke that refuses to dissipate, growing thicker with each passing year rather than fading into comfortable obscurity. If Valiant Thor truly walked the corridors of the Pentagon for 3 years, if he truly advised presidents and military officials on matters of cosmic importance, then where is the paper trail? In a bureaucracy that documents everything from coffee requisitions to classified weapons programs, how could a being from another world leave absolutely no official footprint? No security clearances, no visitor logs, no photographs from the thousands of cameras that monitor those halls every single day. The silence of the official record is deafening, and yet it proves nothing. After all, the most sensitive secrets are the ones that leave no trace at all. But if we dismiss it as elaborate fiction, as the fantasy of a few deluded individuals seeking attention or profit, then we must confront an equally troubling mystery. Why did Frank Stranges maintain his story with unwavering consistency until his death in 2013? Why did Harley Bird, who claimed to have escorted Thor through the Pentagon, never recant his testimony? Why did Nancy Warren, who said she worked alongside this visitor from Venus, hold to her account even when faced with ridicule? These were not people seeking fame. They had everything to lose and nothing to gain from perpetuating a lie. And then there are the predictions. According to those who met him, Thor spoke of environmental catastrophes that would grip our planet, of technologies that would connect humanity in ways previously unimaginable, of social upheaval and the dangerous trajectory of our civilization. Decades later, we watch these prophecies materialize in our daily news feeds. Was it merely prescient observation, or did someone from beyond our world see the patterns we were too close to recognize? The deeper mystery asks us to consider our place in a universe vast beyond comprehension. Are we truly the only conscious minds gazing up at the stars, or are we being observed by intelligences measuring our worthiness? Do civilizations beyond our understanding watch our wars, our destruction of our own planet, our treatment of each other, and make judgments about our future? Perhaps most unsettling of all are the recent claims. Multiple individuals across different continents report contact with Valiant Thor in recent years, messages that carry a consistent theme. His promised return is imminent. He is coming back to see what we have learned, to assess whether humanity has evolved beyond its destructive patterns, or whether we remain a species teetering on the edge of self-annihilation. Somewhere in the infinite darkness between worlds, beyond our satellites and space stations, beyond even our ability to perceive, Valiant Thor may still be watching, waiting, deciding if we are worth saving, or if we have already made our choice. The answer may arrive sooner than we imagine, and we may not be prepared for what it reveals about who we truly are. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.